Yeah, I was watching this on Sid Roth and I decided to record it. Um, you know, I found so many things in the Bible. Like the thing I found, I used to wake up at 4:44 all the time. I thought, well, what does fours mean? And then I bought this $600 computer Bible back in 2009, and basically found out that the word God was in the King James version of the Bible 4,444 times. Then, sometime after that, God gave me an idea to write a book about. And I never did write the book, but still might write it. But in the verse, he showed me, in the verse, Solomon said, "As a man thinks in his heart, so is he." I recorded thousands of hours on this back in 2009 and henceforth. I mean, thousands of hours of stuff I recorded on this topic. But he showed me that in Solomon's verse it says, "As a man thinks in his heart, so is he." So, as a man thinks is DNA or seed. So thinks is the DNA, right? As a man, that's what. As a man thinks, which is in the Bible, the word God, which has, I mean, the word which whom Jesus is 4 letters. As a man thinks, which a word, by the way, can be good or evil. It can be Satan's DNA or God's DNA. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So I was going to write a book about spiritual DNA, and so you got to understand your DNA speaks. Remember, God spoke in Genesis, and things were created. So as we think, the way we think about certain things, we become that. Remember, God said, "I am what I am." So God is in the King James Version of the Bible 4,444 times, and I used to wake up at 4:44. So then when I saw the 444, God is in the King James Bible 4,444 times. I thought, wow, that's unusual. And I remembered it was unusual. That's all I remembered. Then God, like I said, was going to give me a book about DNA, spiritual DNA. Never did write that book, but recorded thousands of hours. Then I started noticing that all the fours, like Jesus, who's the Word, 4 letters. Jesus, who's the King. King is 4 letters. Jesus, cross, it has 4 points. Even north, south, east, and west, 4 corners of the dimension we live in, right? I guess. Then there's love. God is love. 4 letters, right? And then even the word God itself is a 4-letter Hebrew word. 4-letter Hebrew word. So, and there's other 4s, like the closest disciple to Jesus, John, who wrote the 4th gospel. And you can just find 4s, like you'll see Revelation, you'll see 4s in the Bible. You'll just see these 4s. There's even an angel in the Sid Roth show that came, and he was called the Winds of Change, and he dropped his feather. It looked like a corkscrew. When I saw it, since I was going to write a book, Spiritual DNA, and I knew what DNA corkscrews around. When I saw that feather, and by the way, this feather, you could pinch this feather off that this guy found. I should mention the guy's name, but I can't think of it. I should know the guy's name. He's on the Sid Roth show. And you could pinch his feather off and it'll grow back. When I saw the feather, Sid and this other guy had no clue what the feather meant. But this guy's talking about some stuff, by the Bible's by design. So I wanted to record this show. I just want to throw in that little bit. And before I recorded this episode that I saw on Sid Roth on ISN, I was afraid that it might not be in Sid's archives anymore, and I didn't want to lose it. So without any more ado, I'm going to record this just so I can put it on YouTube, because I just want to have access to this, because I don't know what all this guy's going to say. But I watched a little bit of it, and he said something. He was showing the design of the Bible. He's even talking about things that I've talked about as far as time and different things. But so let's. I just wanted to record this and put it on YouTube so I have access to it. So I'm gonna get my image out of the way here, and let's go at it.
In 285 BC through 270, under Ptolemy Philadelphus, he's funded it. They needed a copy of the Jewish scriptures. My formal name, they call me Chuck, but I'm dwells outside the restriction.
About me.
This is God's slaves. This former Fortune 500 CEO and consultant to CBS for several primetime television specials has uncovered new scientific evidence proving the accuracy of the Bible. Next on this edition of It's Supernatural.
Centuries have come and gone, offering wisdom and understanding throughout the ages. Today there should be nothing beyond one's power to discover. And yet, the strange, unusual, and mysterious world of the supernatural defies understanding. Stay tuned for a unique and powerful investigation into a curious, undiscovered universe only on It's Supernatural.
Hello, I'm Sid Roth, your investigative reporter. I'm here with Chuck Missler, and I've so been looking forward to this interview because, you see, Chuck is a very successful businessman. He's been CEO of Fortune 500 companies, and he's so knowledgeable about the new data that is available today that conclusively, absolutely proves that we can trust the Bible. Chuck, why can we trust the Bible?
Well, that's a big subject. There's many reasons. I think the first discovery, there's two discoveries in our way of thinking that will make this clear. The first discovery is that we have here 66 books that were penned by over 40 different guys over thousands of years, and yet we now discover it evidences a deliberate design from end to end. And I don't mean just in theme. We discover that every number, every letter, every place name appears to be deliberately in place by deliberate, skillful design. But the second discovery, for the first discovery is the integrity of the whole, which is startling. But the second discovery is that it has to do with its origin. See, let me back up a little bit, Sid. We all assume that time is linear and absolute. And we do that because
that's what we live in, that type of situation.
And in school, the teacher wrote a line on the blackboard from left to right. The left end was the birth of somebody, the founding of an empire or whatever, and the right end was the end of that person or empire. So we tend, from that experience, to think that time is linear and absolute. From that background, when we start talking about eternity or God, we tend to imagine someone who has lots of time. We tend to think of eternity as a line that starts at infinity on the left and goes to infinity on the right. That God is simply someone who has lots of time. Well, that's poetic and it's useful in our songs and things, but it's bad physics. Because we know from Einstein's theory of relativity that time is a physical property. Time varies with mass, acceleration, or gravity. Now, is God subject to gravity? Of course not. So God is not somebody who has lots of time. God is somebody that dwells outside the restrictions of the physical world.
That'd be a great realm to dwell in.
Exactly. Well, the point is, if God has the technology to create us in the first place, he has the technology to get a message to us. But how does he authenticate the message? How does he let us know that the message is really from him and not some kind of contrivance or a fraud of some kind? One way, probably there's many answers to that, we'll talk about a few, but one of the answers is to demonstrate that the origin of his message is from outside time. That's what Isaiah means when he says that it is he that inhabiteth eternity.
Okay, so how does he demonstrate this?
By writing history before it happens. He declares that he alone knows the end from the beginning. Let me use an analogy to get this across. Let's assume we're watching a major parade. We're sitting on the curb, and around the corner comes the marching units, the bands, whatever. For us, sitting at that curb, the parade is a sequence of events. But to someone who's outside the plane of that existence, say in a chopper above, they could see the beginning and the end simultaneously.
Of course.
And that's exactly the position God is.
But Chuck, a lot of skeptics say the predictions or the prophecies in the Bible are so general that of course they come true. They're not that specific. How would you respond?
They are shockingly, astonishingly specific.
Give me an example.
Well, the most interesting ones tend to get a little technical. But let me give you a simple.
That's specific that they're too technical sometimes.
Well, exactly. But let me give you a simple one
Okay.
that people may find provocative. This is a more subtle thing, but at the same time I think it'll be provocative. And that's the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when you read the book of Genesis, the first few chapters are kind of interesting. You got the creation, you got the whole incident in the garden and all of that. That's straightforward. But we get to from chapter 6 on, you've got the flood of Noah and all of that. But chapter 5 is one of those chapters that we tend to skip over because it's a genealogy
It's
of
got
10
a lot
people.
of names, right?
Just names. And we have 10 people there from Adam. It's basically the genealogy from Adam to Noah. And when we read that in the English Bible, we stumble in a sense because the names are not translated. We don't translate names. My formal name, they call me Chuck, but I'm Charles. What does Charles mean? Different people have different opinions. No one knows what that means. Well, in the Hebrew, though, you can infer the meaning of the names because of the roots.
Yes.
So let's just go through a few of these, okay? Adam is pretty straightforward. That's man, right? Adamah,
Right.
man, okay? He had a son by the name of Seth. And what does Seth imply? It's a root that implies appointed. We get a clue from that from the previous chapter. When Eve gave birth to Seth, she felt he was appointed to be a replacement for Abel,
That's
whom
correct.
Cain slew. The word Seth suggests appointed. When Seth has a son, his name is Enosh, which comes from Anash. It's an incurable wound or woe or grief or whatever. It means mortal, in effect. Enosh has a son by the name of Canaan. Some English Bibles have it misappropriated in Canaan. No, it's Kenan. In fact, Balaam does a pun on on the Kenites in Numbers 24. It really means sorrow. We go on. Now, those two guys probably had a belly full of these horrible names, mortal and sorrow. So when Kenan had a son, he named him Mahalalel. Mahalal is the blessed or praised one. El is the name for God.
So what you're doing, though, is, if I'm understanding you right, is you're taking the names in
And
Genesis in order
And looking at the Hebrew roots, what they
and
imply.
what they imply. So we have 10 names.
10 names.
And when we find out what each one of these 10 mean,
It's an exploration. Let's see what they say.
okay,
And Mahalalel has a son by the name of Yared. And Yared has which means it's a verb. Yarad shall come down. And we have Enoch, which is an academic term, meaning commencement or teaching. Now, Enoch's perhaps one of the more interesting ones. I should back up. Most people don't realize that the flood of Noah did not come as a surprise. It was preached on for 4 generations. But what we learn about Enoch is when he was 65, something very strange happened, because from that day on, it says he walked with God, whatever that means.
sounds good to me.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Enoch apparently had a prophecy that as long as his son that was just born would live, the judgment of the flood would be withheld. So he named him after 2 Hebrew roots, Muth, which means his death, and from a derivative of the verb shalach, which shall bring. The name Methuselah actually means his death shall bring. It's suggestive of that prophecy that was given when he was born.
So we have a sentence now by those names.
It's coming. I got a couple more, and then we'll look
Okay.
at it. Methuselah's son was Lamech. Now here's a root that we use in English, lament, and so it means despairing. And Lamech has a son by the name of Noah. We've all heard of Noah, but his name comes from Noah, which means comfort. In fact, Lamech tells us that. He says he tells us why he named him Noah. He says, the same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands and so on. So now we have these names, and if we read them in English, they're meaningless to us. Adam, Seth, Enosh, and so on.
Of course.
Let's read them with the English implications of the roots, as I just said. Man is appointed mortal sorrow. The blessed God shall come down, teaching that his death, God's death, shall bring the despairing comfort or rest.
That is so good that Chuck, I'm
I just wanted to throw some. There's another video I watched tonight. I'm just sitting there chilling. But there was another video I watched tonight. Which talked about the blessing of the Father. But I don't have time to get into that one. But I might record. I'm going to record a video on that one. But the important thing I wanted to show here was his death shall bring comfort. Remember Jesus in John chapter, it was after John chapter 13, 14. He got somewhere on, as you go on in there, you'll see he talks about the Comforter. He said that your joy will be full. He's speaking to the disciples, and he says, I'll send the Comforter, which is the presence and Spirit of God, right? Because Jesus was going to leave, but he was going to send the Comforter. And even the Ark of the Covenant, when the Ark of the Covenant was with Israel, they prevailed over their enemies, right? The Ark of the Covenant was like a blessing. So how did Jesus bring comfort? Jesus bring comfort because, number one, by his blood, we're joined back to God. All the discomfort started in Genesis when we sinned and we separated ourselves from God, and then we got through into the jungle, basically, in the wildness, everything. And then rock and roll singers sing "Welcome to the Jungle." What was that song by was it the Rolling Stones or one of those groups? I'm not real big on rock and roll. I remember the songs, but not so much the players. That song sings "Welcome to the Jungle," and that's exactly what Adam and Eve got into, man. They went from paradise into the jungle. So in the Bible, he's always trying to bring us back to Canaan land, a place of comfort. And you see, when they finally did get in Canaan land, the fullness of the blessing of God, when God's temple was set up and when God's glory filled the temple, then all of a sudden they were at peace, and all the nations brought them gold. During Solomon's time, and that could have remained if they wouldn't have sinned. That would have remained to this day. They would have been a leader for the world. And the United States kind of took over because the gospel flourished here, because there was too much oppression in England, so they came here because they wanted to have religious freedom. They used to kill people just for making copies of the Bible. If you made a copy of the Bible, you get burned, which is, you think of that stuff that was crazy, but we're doing things right now. We're aborting babies. You know, in a certain amount of time, that people might think that that's like, what the heck were wrong with them? Like we hear where they were killing people for burning Bible. If you made a copy of the Bible, they would kill you. you translate it into English, or if you made a copy of the Bible, they would kill you. You weren't allowed to have it. But we're aborting babies, so in time, if we ever come to our sanity, we're able to say, boy, they were evil in those days. They were killing babies. But I just wanted to point out, the Holy Spirit, once we got joined back to God by the blood of Jesus Christ, who was the Lamb of God, and they even got comfort when they came out of Egypt, when they first presented the lamb, and they slain the lamb, put the blood on the doorpost. Their firstborn was protected, where the firstborn represents Jesus' firstborn. Jesus, firstborn of God, and then if they didn't have Jesus, their firstborn died, right? They didn't have the protection of God, the comfort. So Israel was hit by curse after curse, but Israel was not. So even in perilous times, Christians will be blessed, while the curse will fall on those that it falls on, who don't have the blood of the Lamb. So let's replay what that guy just played again, because it's really and like I was saying, God's in the Bible 4,444 times. There's no mistake to anything God does. Like, God spoke to me in an audible voice twice in my life. And it took me 40 years. It took me 40 years to realize that He knew everything about me by what He spoke to me. And someday maybe I'll record something on how that pertained after I write one of my books or so. Or maybe I'll just put it in one of my books, because it's kind of deep. I don't have time to get into it. But it took me 40 years, the things that He spoke to me, that means He knew my total personality. He knew everything about me. Therapists try to get to know you so they can help you, and I've never been to a therapist, only once. I went one time back in the day. And I imagine therapists trying to get to know how you think. I don't know what they do. Because I didn't have time to do it back then when I went. And everybody has issues, Therapy ultimately is really, at least in my condition, like it's just overthinking. And I don't want to get into all of that. It's too deep. So that's another video. But overthinking or fear or worry, those are the things that kick us out of. See, all that stuff is an attempt to gain control. Worry, fear, all of those things. They're attempt to gain control over things we don't have control over, right? So the more overthinking is just an attempt to control stuff. You can drive yourself crazy if you. There's nothing wrong with thinking in the fact that you're doing it consciously and deliberately to solve a problem. What can happen is people do emotional thinking, and that's where it gets destructive, not only to yourself but to other people. But I don't want to get into all that stuff. It's a very interesting topic. But God's been my therapist for 40 years. It's called the Holy Spirit, and He's 1,000 times smarter than any human. Well, 1,000, a million. He's light years more intelligent than any human. And it was much more. It was nice being schooled by Him instead of man. Because I don't really trust men. But I imagine there's some good therapists out there. And anybody that's learned from God could be a therapist also. But It's interesting stuff, very interesting stuff. But anyway, let's get on with the video.
I want you to say that one more time. Each of those 10 names, their actual meaning put together forms a sentence and says,
Man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down, teaching that his death shall bring the despairing comfort.
now I don't say that that is subtle. I say that that is a blast, you atheist. We'll be right back after this. Hello, I'm Sid Roth, your investigative reporter. I'm here with Chuck Missler, and he said, well, I'll just give you a little subtle reason why we believe in the integrity of the Bible. So what does he do? He turns to the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, and he looks at the genealogy in the 5th chapter. It's 10 names. We know them by whatever the name says, but what he said is whatever the name says has a meaning, and the meanings form a sentence. So if you take each of the first 10 names in order, the exact meaning, it'll form a sentence. And what is that sentence?
Man is appointed mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down, teaching that his death, God's death, shall bring the despairing comfort or rest.
That's absolutely amazing.
Well, there's a couple of textual issues here. First of all, you'll never convince me that a group of Jewish rabbis contrived to hide this summary of what would be called the Christian gospel in a genealogy in the Torah. No way.
Well, obviously they're not going to hide it, but what I'd like to know is, have you ever had occasion to share that with a Jewish rabbi?
Oh yes, we have, and in fact.
So what does the rabbi say beyond?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that constitutes a proof.
Mm-hmm.
It's really just a discovery that points in a direction. And now there are other examples that are crisper, but a little more technical. In Daniel chapter 9, here's the key points. The Old Testament, as we would call it, was translated into Greek in 285 BC through 270 under Ptolemy Philadelphus. He's funded it. They needed a copy of the Jewish scriptures in Greek, because that's what everybody spoke in those days. So they translated it. The importance of this is that we have copies of that, and it was done in the 3rd century before Christ was born. In that document, we have, of course, the book of Daniel. Set aside who wrote under what conditions. It's there in black and white. Daniel prays, concerned for his people, is visited by Gabriel, which gives him, Daniel, a 4-verse prophecy that lays out, in effect, everything forthcoming. But what it includes, Gabriel says to Daniel, bear in mind he's in slavery in Babylon, Jerusalem is in rubble, several hundred miles to the west. He says, from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem unto the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah, the King, will be a certain number of days. And when you work out the arithmetic from the language, it's 173,880 days. Okay. We know the date of that decree. It was Artaxerxes Longimanus in 14. Thanks to Sir Robert Anderson, head of Scotland Yard way back when, in 1894 published a book in which he went to the trouble of nailing that date down. When we count the days from there, then the problem is, when does it end? It ends when Messiah the King. Now, if you study the Gospels, you discover that Jesus, several times he tried to take and make him as a king, but he'd just slip away. He says, my hour has not yet come. Then one day he does something weird. He not only permits it, he arranges it. Tells his disciples to go to a certain place, give him a password, get a donkey. He rides the donkey, deliberately fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9:9, riding the donkey in Jerusalem. When you look at those dates, it comes out to the exact day that Gabriel told Daniel in Daniel chapter 9. Now, that's, to me, absolutely breathtaking for several reasons.
All right, let me see if I get this straight now. We had a starting point.
Starting point from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem.
And then the exact number of years that it would take.
Yes, it's expressed in a strange way that gets into the text. Basically, it's 173,880 days.
Okay, and then what would happen at that point?
To the Messiah the King.
to his birth?
The
or?
only day. No, it says the Messiah the King.
Ah, so
Now, all
that he
through
would
his
be king.
ministry, several times you're going to take him and make him as a king, the enthusiasm of the crowd. He slips away. Mine hour has not yet come. Then one day he deliberately allows himself to ride this donkey into Jerusalem. We call it Palm Sunday or the triumphal entry, in which, as they go, his disciples sing Psalm 118. And the Pharisees are upset because they recognize that in the context that that's happening, they're blaspheming. They're calling him the Messiah.
Sure, there's the 118th Psalm says the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, and we chant this at Pesach, at Passover.
And I think it's verse 26. It's blessed is the King that cometh in the King that cometh in the name of the Lord. They're saying that. The Pharisees around there are upset because they realize these guys are inadvertently blaspheming. Master, you rebuke your disciples. He says if they held their peace, the very stones would cry out. In other words, he encourages it. He, in effect, is allowing himself at that moment to be presented to Jerusalem as king. It turns out that's 173,880 days from the date of that decree to rebuild Jerusalem. It comes out, when you go through the trouble of going through the arithmetic, it comes out precisely to the very day.
Now, you're a logical man. Is there any way to explain that beyond the fact that God knew what would happen?
Exactly. I think this represents such an unequivocal demonstration that Jesus Christ really was who he claimed to be. That was when I was a teenager, when I discovered that, it was shown to me, it blew me away. And of course, obviously through the last, 40 years, been studying it even more carefully. It's staggering.
I have to ask you, again, have you ever shared this with a Jewish rabbi?
Oh, sure.
And what is the reaction?
Well, it varies. Some reactions are one of staggering acceptance and getting into it and investigating further. And of course, all of these things have ways to be denied or refuted or dismissed or shined on. We've all done that. So, as they say, where you have two Jews, you've got three opinions. So there's all kinds of views. But if you take the trouble to study it carefully, the last 4 verses of Daniel 9, and the more you can get into the original Hebrew, the clearer it becomes. And you contrast that with what in Luke chapter 19, you discover a number of things. Not only does it predict the exact day, you discover, if you look carefully at Luke 19, that Jesus held them accountable to know that day. And it's that point that he predicts the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, that not one stone would be left upon another and all that. And the passage in Daniel also describes that after this, the Messiah will be cut off, executed. The Old Testament actually presents that the Messiah will be killed. And indeed he was, of course, on the cross. And so you and I are beneficiaries of love story. It was written in blood on the wooden cross.
The thing that's so amazing to me, Chuck, is that you share this with a Jewish rabbi who knows the Hebrew so well. And even though it is so specific, rabbis are instructed not to think for themselves, to go on the thinking of the ancient rabbis. But I'm saying to rabbis, I'm saying to Jewish people, I'm saying to non-Jewish people, to Muslims, respect your heritage, but think for yourself, because it's your life. It's your life that's at stake. It's your purpose, it's your destiny. And consider this a divine appointment with God as to why you're watching right now. Now, we'll be back in a moment. And if you are atheistic in persuasion, I don't believe you will be after you hear what Chuck has to say. Be right back.
Many viewers report testimonies of miracles, signs and wonders, and healings as a result of watching It's Supernatural.
I'm 19 now, but got saved at 16, and your show was here to guide me and help me grow in the Word and the supernatural of God. The testimonies I heard gave me such a great faith and made me want to live in holiness and righteousness. If it wasn't for It's Supernatural, I don't think I would be where I am today.
I am 17 and would like to say this ministry has changed my whole life. I have been saved for about 4 months now, and my whole life has changed. Amazing. It's the best thing that has ever happened to me. This ministry has really brought my faith to a new level.
If you've been touched through watching It's Supernatural, share your testimony at sidroth.org/praise.
Maybe that's what we need so that we can sit still to hear the facts. But something
is
is
more than that. I think it takes openness. So many of us are victims of our cultural background, and we're blinded by prejudices, not from the Scripture, but by what people have said about the Scripture. I think that Christians are just as vulnerable as the Jews are. Jews are excessively committed to the Talmudic traditions rather than looking at what their text says. Christians are the same way. They'll believe some popular speaker or some allegorical interpretation rather than just read it. I think God says what he means and means what he says. And part of the magic is very simple, is to be open-minded and get into, hear him, God, what he's saying, not what some interpreter has said.
Out of curiosity, with the background that you have so extensive in the corporate world, how did you become so convinced the Bible was from God?
Well, my technical background is really in the information sciences. And I think one of the things that staggered me as I began to discover the integrity of design of all these different books, 66 of them, over thousands of years, realizing that they have been managed by some unseen hand. You discover, as you get into it, the truth is in the details. Every number, every place name, every detail is there by design, and the design evidences knowledge of what's coming, what the end is. And Christ's life being the best example, that there's over 300 details of his life that was fulfilled while he did his ministry. His death on the cross fulfills all kinds of details in the Torah and in the Psalms and elsewhere. And so it's the precision of that and the recognition that precision could only have been established by someone outside space-time itself that blows you away. And it's right there. You can study it. It's tangible. You can get your hands on it.
What is the best thing you would say to an agnostic, an honest agnostic, or a dishonest atheist? I say dishonest atheist because you say you know there is no God. Now, come on. Be a little more intelligent than say, I know there is no God. All you can do is say, I'm not sure. That's an agnostic. That's what you really are. So talk to the honest agnostic.
Investigate. He's honest and he's open. It's the most important thing of his life, because if there is truth here and that truth is going to determine his destiny, it deserves a high priority investigation.
But what about Darwin? What about this whole evolution business?
Well, now that's, you put your finger on the greatest myth of our society. It imbues our psychology, our culture, not just biology, the whole. And today, the good news is scientists are finally beginning to admit that Darwinism, or evolution as we talk, that's a very imprecise term. What we really mean is the biogenesis, that life began as an accident, defies all the scientific evidence. We have a spectrum of possibilities.
Well, wait, if it defies the scientific evidence, why do we believe it?
Cultural pressure, career planning. There are people fired that if the staff discovers they're creationist in their orientation. And yet there are books like Philip Johnson's Darwin on Trial, Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box.
Give me one reason why it is unscientific. One.
It violates all the entropy laws. It's impossible. Natural selection, which is the premise of Darwinism, can only operate if there's something to select. It doesn't operate to create inanimate material from inanimate chemicals. The Darwinist theory is if you have matter and energy and you mix those together, you can get life. It's an unbalanced equation. Matter and energy plus information. What the Darwinist cannot explain is the origin, not of life, of information. Because if something is highly probable, it happens all the time, we call that a scientific law. If something's highly improbable, we call that design. That's what cryptography deals with. You got what looks to be a jumble of letters, but if you discover in those letters design, a message, that's called cryptography, or a detective, forensics. When you have a highly improbable event that's occurred, we impute design. So life lies between those two boundaries. Either highly probable, which like a scientific law, highly predictable. Most of life's in the middle, we call that chance. But if it's highly unlikely to have occurred by chance, we call that design. Well, as you start looking at, for example, let's take the best example is DNA. You have a DNA molecule that we now discover, is a 3 out of 4 error-correcting code. Now, first of all, it's a digital code. Like Paul Revere, one if by land, two if by sea.
And why couldn't that just happen?
Because a digital code takes significance by prearrangement.
Of course.
It can't happen randomly. If you have code happening randomly, you have to have an engine to process that code. They can't each evolve asynchronously. They have to be highly coordinated. So that's part of the answer. There's also a concept of irreducible complexity. If I take a mousetrap, it consists of 5 things: a spring, a hammer, a hook, and If I only have 4 of those 5 things, I don't catch 4/5 of a mouse. In other words, there's a point at which you can't reduce it and still have it functional. So the question is, how do you get to that functional? It turns out there is no scenario, evolutionary speaking, to get to something that has irreducible complexity. Now, when we look at what was called a simple cell in Darwin's day, we discover today that that simple cell is more complex than an entire city, an entire automated factory. And
Whoa. Stop right there.
okay,
That simple cell is more complex than an entire city? And you're telling me that this just happened by chance and coincidence, a little more coincidence? How much more do you need? I'm going to tell you a fair thing to do. Why don't you pray this prayer? Dear God, tell me the truth about Jesus, and as I read the Bible, show me the truth about the Bible. You see, it's personal. That's all God's trying to do, is to get your attention. I believe He's got your attention. Now it's up.
I had no clue the guy was going to talk about DNA. I was getting ready for work here. I'm brushing my teeth and stuff. But I had no clue he was going to talk about DNA. I put DNA at the beginning of this. He started talking about DNA at the end of this. But I'm sure he didn't know the stuff that I knew. That God's in the King James Version of the Bible 4,444 times, and that I'd read a book about DNA. So I never listened to the end of this until I just now heard it with you guys. And as I'm interrupting right now, I was talking about the DNA. But that's what the book is. It's by design. I got something on my wall that says, "Things do not happen, things are made to happen." John F. Kennedy. I got that on my wall. Another thing he don't know, this guy probably doesn't know about it, I had a time revelation. I only have 4 minutes left. 4 minutes. Well, actually 3 now. I have 4 minutes left to finish this, but I had a time revelation where I was praying and time slowed down. And I didn't think too much of it. And then I was praying again, and time greatly slowed down. I mean, it tremendously slowed down. This is like 40 years ago. And my friend panicked and was like, "What's going on? Time is slowing down." And it freaked him out, but he didn't know I was praying. This was like 40 years ago. And when I looked over at him and discontinued praying, then time resumed. And I later found out that people that have near-death experiences, there's no time. And he was talking about in the beginning of this that there's no time outside of heaven. He was talking about this stuff. And then, so I had that revelation, because this guy wasn't a Christian, had no clue I was praying, and time greatly slowed down. Then I figured out that after hearing near-death experiences, there wasn't any time where these people would go in heaven. The time didn't exist. I started putting pieces of it together, because there was a group of people that were keeping the earth that God said multiply, that you see the fossil record. But the main focus is on the sons of God, or the people that were in the garden. One was keeping the earth, one was keeping the garden. When the people who were keeping the garden got kicked out of time when they sinned, remember God said, "Where art thou? Where art thou now?" They got kicked out of time. That's when they started to die. They got kicked out of time. I mean, out of no time. They got kicked into time, and then they joined the people that were keeping the earth. So then when Abraham finally catches God's attention, then you see a shift where Abraham says, "Separate" again. So then you see the two separate. The two came together. Remember, the sons of God sold the daughters of men, and they joined together, and they got cut down to 120 years. When they were living thousands of years. Then all of a sudden they got cut down to 120 years. So I only got 30 seconds. I got to get out of here. so you'll see Jesus with this different type of body, which he's trying to get us back to. You see Adam and Eve were like angels. They didn't come together until after the fall. Then you see God separate them. Then you see God change into this Jesus. Change as we get after we die, then we get resurrected. We get this new body that Jesus has, which he can pop inside of buildings. And remember, Adam and Eve didn't have any children before they died. I mean, before they until they got the curse. And they stepped out of one kingdom and the connection to God. It's just like an umbilical cord. They were connected to God. They were on the earth, but they were connected to God. But once they sinned, it's just like cutting off an umbilical cord. And they were birthed into time. They cut off. God said you would die. He said if you sin, if you eat this, you'll sin and then you'll die. And that's exactly what happened. It's just like being out in space and you're separated from the mother tank, and all of a sudden all you got left is your spacesuit, and that's all the air you got. So you don't die right away, but it's a matter of time. So anyway, that's all the time I got for right now. But very interesting. It's interesting you start talking about DNA. And yeah, that's all I got for now. So I'm going to stop this recording. See you guys later.